Having looked at Pit Fighter a couple of videos back and pretty much having taken it over the coals, I kinda wonder if I gave the one impression about games like that, particularly games with digitised sprites and so on. They may be a bit cheesy, they may be a bit 90s, hilariously kitschy and uncool, but when done right, well, they could actually make something quite special. It's just that so few games manage to actually do that. But it's not like you have to go down into the depths of obscurity to find the best example. It lies in the most famous and most influential game, or series of games, to use digitised actors. Mortal Kombat's reputation has gone through the ringer, out and back again so many times, it's easy to lose count. In some circles it's an embarrassing relic of the 90s, a lousy game that was boosted up to no end by rivers of blood. Others, like myself, see it differently. That yes, there was all the blood, all the fatalities, all the controversy, but there was also a rather special game in there, one that didn't take itself too seriously, one that was made with a brilliant sense of just what worked in the arcade, and sold itself better than just about any other game had done up to that point. As easy as it might be to mock, and as easy as it is to wave away any success by thinking that it's just easy to sell blood and gore, there's no denying the game's lasting appeal, and the fact that the series is still around, still one of the premier fighting games even, 25 years on. If you want proof of that, well, let's look at all the games that tried to be Mortal Kombat and failed in miserable, utterly hilarious fashion. Mortal Kombat's inspiration is in ways quite similar to Pit Fighter. It's all about martial arts movies, grand tournaments and the like, but it's a more fantastical style with trappings of the supernatural. You can clearly see Pit Fighter's influence in the schlocky American kung fu movies of the 80s, but for Mortal Kombat it's all about clear signposts and some heartfelt tributes. Or whip-offs maybe. A progression of the game's original idea, which was to make a digitised fighting game starring Jean-Claude Van Damme. The Lin Kuei ninjas, Scorpion and Sub-Zero, are classic ninja goons who've taken a degree in badass. Liu Kang is pure and uncut Bruce Lee, just as Johnny Cage is a glammed up Jean-Claude. Sonya was heavily inspired by Cynthia Rothrock, you know her from the greatest movie of all time, Undefeatable. Kano is a very cyberpunk-esque villain in a world that perhaps needs something along those lines. Raiden is inspired by David Carradine's Kane from Kung Fu with a spot of lightning thrown in. Shang Tsung makes a fine stand-in for Lo Pan from Big Trouble in Little China. And then there's Goro, a glorious stop-motion creation that wouldn't look out of place in a Way Harryhausen movie. Trapping all of this is a Shaolin Buddhist setting straight out of Wuxia, and story of Wiki-esque oceans of claret dripping all over the screen at every step, usually accompanied by the monk's polite applause. In all honesty, when I can look at a game, almost any game, and see so clearly what inspired the people behind it, all the things that they loved so much that went into the game, it certainly adds a few plus points. The fighting itself follows in a similar vein. Both then and now it was always compared to its main rival, which was, of course, Capcom's Street Fighter 2, and usually unfavourably because Street Fighter had more moves, more buttons, more combos and so forth. But it's always a comparison that's never really sat well, because Mortal Kombat is a totally different fighting game to Street Fighter 2, like they're not even remotely going for the same thing. Whereas Street Fighter accommodates an abundance of different styles, you know, charging attacks, close-up combos, turtling, long-range fireball spam, Mortal Kombat prefers to handle one style extremely well. To excel in this game you have to get up close and personal and swing for the fences. Combos aren't so much of a thing because that's not the fighting style that this game's trying to emulate. Whereas Street Fighter goes into that kind of more anime direction, Mortal Kombat's trying to look like a live action movie that's all about the big hits, whether it's the flurry of low and high punches, the sweep that takes you off your feet, or the powerful finishing uppercut. That uppercut, the signature move of the series really, is by far the most rewarding move in terms of damage and the toughest to pull off successfully. As signposted as it is, it needs to be set up to actually succeed. One does not simply walk into another person's fist. Every character does have a long-range projectile, if only because it would have been unthinkable to have a fighting game without them in 1992, but the most effective and memorable ones, Sub-Zero's Ice Blast and Scorpion's signature Spear, are the ones that help the player close up the gap and get in flat uppercut. You ain't gonna get him close just to do a freaking high kick now, are you? What Mortal Kombat can also offer with its fighting, better than virtually any other fighting game, is a whole load of satisfaction in how it's presented. The sound effects and voices are rightly legendary and add so much to every single blow, whether it's Scorpion's "Come here!", the crowd gasping at a particularly good move and the "excellent" that accompanies an uppercut, the Bruce Lee-esque yowls of Liu Kang, or just the harrowing scream that follows from the game's signature move, the Fatality. Finishing a fight with style has always been something to aim for in any fighting game. There's always something more satisfying about ending a fight with a dragon punch as opposed to a low kick. With a simple shout of "finish him" or her, however, Mortal Kombat provided the official coup de grace, a set of moves that at first were completely hidden but spread more and more with word of mouth. All of a sudden you can rip someone's head off, or blow them a kiss of death, or send 500,000 volts coursing through their body, or tear their still-beating heart out of their chest, holding it up to the heavens as a final, decisive mark of your victory. Now, the first fatality that anyone is likely to see in Mortal Kombat is, of course, the pit. For all the blood that splatters everywhere when you hit someone in the game, this was different. You finish someone on that stage, do the victory uppercut as you do, and instead of falling onto the ground, they fall off the stage, screaming, and down into a pit of spikes, impaling them. Before Mortal Kombat, you only ever thought that you'd just beaten the shit out of someone, or knocked them unconscious. The win quote, usually accompanied by the loser's bruised up face, seemed to confirm that. In Mortal Kombat? Nah, there's no win quote. There's no bruised up face. Your opponent dies horribly. Well, at least until the next time you pick them on the selection screen. There's just something about a fight in Mortal Kombat. Every blow comes with loud cries of anguish, every move seems like something out of a movie. For some it's not necessarily going to appeal, it's too graphic, it's perhaps a little clunky when compared to something more free-flowing like Street Fighter. There's so much about Mortal Kombat that's just based around sheer flair, like Johnny Cage's crotch punch or Liu Kang's flying kicks, not to mention the fatalities themselves. And it is not necessarily the quickest or smoothest of fighting games. But it sure is fun. There are those who hate the game, those who kind of get a kick out of it, and those few who just love it. And yeah, that's me. And the sequels would just ratchet it up even more to varying degrees of effect. An absolutely brilliant sequel that's just as good if not better, a third game that was a little bit disappointing, and loads more besides, some great, some trash. But the place in my heart belongs to that first game more than anything else. It may not even be the best in the series, but when anyone says the words Mortal Kombat, or even the word excellent, the first image that comes into my head is someone uppercutting somebody's head off in front of an audience of polite monks. Of course, it would be silly to not mention the other things. I mentioned previously that no game sold itself quite like Mortal Kombat, certainly not then. I'd put it forward as one of the most influential games of the whole decade, not just because of the violence and gore that would become commonplace in the PlayStation era, and certainly not because of all the crappy fighting games that would try to rip it off over the next couple of years. Even if you take all that out, Mortal Kombat remains massively influential based on how it was sold and what Midway pushed the game as being. It was of course a pretty natural thing in the arcades where for the most part anything goes, but the real trailblazing happened when Mortal Kombat arrived at home, by far the most hyped up port from the arcade since Street Fighter 2. Acclaim, the brains behind the port, were not beholden to any one platform either. Mortal Kombat would come out on every platform available, with the main 4 versions, the Mega Drive and SNES, and handheld versions for Game Boy and Game Gear, coming out on the same day, September the 13th, 1993, a day that Acclaim dubbed Mortal Monday. It was an exceptionally large ad campaign for the time, naturally boosted up even further by the game's headlining appearance in those US congressional hearings that set up the ESRB. You know, Joe Lieberman, Howard Lincoln virtually marketing the SNES as blood-free Mortal Kombat and the like. But you probably know about most of that, so I'm going to talk about the advert itself instead. It's different, especially when you compare it to what video game ads had mostly been previously. You know, the odd fantasy character here and there, celebrity endorsements, mostly kids playing in their rooms, going all whoa and shit, getting sucked into the experience. Or, you know, just bad-mouthing the competition, the sort of thing that Sega and Commodore like to do. Kinda generic stuff, mostly. The Mortal Kombat ad is one of the first to be very different from this, and in doing so it set up the tone for video game advertising going forward. This might sound silly, but it's a bit more layered and adult, you know, for a video game commercial. Keep that in perspective. Firstly, the sight of groups of teenagers in the street shouting Mortal Kombat and getting together en masse is not meant to assuage anyone's fears, and this was always parroted at the time. You know, that kids will play fighting games, imitate them, and they'll start hitting each other in the streets. A game like Mortal Kombat made this even worse due to the added fear that someone's gonna make like Kano and throw a knife at their friend's chest. Perhaps an advert should try and rebut this point of view. Wouldn't it be best to just have kids enjoying the game at home and nowhere else? Nah, it doubles down. The tone of the advert is very much, yes parent, this is the game that you fear. And so you should. It almost paints September the 13th as if it's gonna be the rapture. Every kid marching through the streets, fixated on blind ugly violence, ready to assault their parents with cries of, can we have Mortal Kombat Dad, can we have Mortal Kombat Dad, can we have Mortal Kombat Dad? Nothing is hidden in the advertisement pretty much. No fatalities or anything, but it's pretty clear as to what the game is. It's one of the enduring video game ads of the 90s, and it helped Acclaim to sell over 3 million copies of the game across all platforms in the first couple of months. For this at times shoddy and junky company, the home launch of Mortal Kombat stands as probably their greatest achievement. Obviously the Mega Drive version was the best one, we all know that because it had the blood and fatalities in it thanks to a code. But leaving that aside, ads for video games started to change gradually after Mortal Kombat's more provocative approach. They certainly became a little bit more edgy and Gen X-y, they caught up with the time. While loads of failures do abound, Nintendo's idea to sell Yoshi's Island with a fat guy exploding perhaps the worst of all, something had changed, and soon folks like Sony were tapping into that big time. The brilliant thing about Mortal Kombat in the home is that it didn't pigeonhole itself, it refused to pare itself down to appeal to a certain demographic. It was for the kids who often played at home, as well as the teens and younger adults who played it in the arcades. And despite all that, the ad was still a resounding success. It points to the sort of thing that Sony would use to sell their console, noting that the audience for games was growing up now, but that doesn't mean you need to stop. In this regard, Mortal Kombat was a bit of a pioneer, and that's an angle that doesn't often get talked about. It certainly was a pioneer both in the arcades and on consoles, rather than computers. At least that angle's more interesting than going through the congressional hearings again, or talking about how the Mega Drive port had blood and the SNES one didn't, and eventually the SNES port of MK2 had blood anyways. Thanks to Mortal Kombat, the nature of video games themselves were changing. For good or bad, I guess depends on who you are and what you like, but Mortal Kombat paved the way for so much that came after. You can't really dismiss it just by looking at something like Way of the Warrior and scoffing that this is Mortal Kombat's legacy, because it's so much more. And perhaps this video has convinced you a little bit of the case for Mortal Kombat as one of the true greats of the arcade, of any era of the arcade, with absolutely nothing needed to apologise for that. No it's great but or anything. It deserves it all on its own. There's a lot of this that I suppose could also be said of Doom too, of course, but one game had to take it to the true homes of gaming, the consoles and the arcade, while another took it to the computers. Doom is of course a subject for another day, I'm sure. For now though, I hope you enjoyed a time when everyone took their trip to the pit, and we knew that one way or another something terrible was going to happen. But who cares as long as it's the other poor bastard, right? Right. Bye for now.